Why the solo album now? Why after 10 years?
It was after Back to the Egg, and I just wanted to do something totally different, and so I got a machine, and just plugged one single microphone into the back of the machine, and didn't use a recording console. And I was originally just going to do 2 weeks messing about, and just have a loon for 2 weeks. At the end of 2 weeks, I'd done a few tracks, and I was starting to get into it. So I kept it another 2 weeks, and another 2 weeks, and another 2 weeks. I ended up having it for over 6 weeks or something, I think. And it just kept coming out, I just kept... I wasn't trying to do an album. In fact, I was trying not to do an album, just for my own satisfaction and stuff. But in the end, I had a few tracks, and I played them to a couple of people, and they said, "Oh, I see, that's your next album." And then it occurred to me, oh yeah, probably is. So then I got a bit serious on it and tried to make it into an album, which was the worst part of it. I was having fun till then,
Two things occurred to me when I heard it yesterday for the first time. One, two names occurred to me. One was Brian Eno. The other thing that came to mind when I heard it was Stevie Wonder. I mean, is he somebody that you have a lot of...
Yeah, I like Stevie, a lot, yeah. And it's probably just because he's the only other kind of person who's done this way of recording an album, recording it all yourself. And he did, I think it was Music of My Mind, that way, where he just played everything. Did you want some sugar?
Yeah.
Where he played everything. And in that way, yeah, that's similar, because I think we're the only two people I can think of who've actually done this.
Well, you're also the only two people I can think of who combine sort of avant-garde electronic sounds with, like, an infallible sense for melody. That's the other thing that brings...
Well, I can't help that. That kind of, it's one... No, I'm glad I can't help it, but when I was doing this album, I thought I'll make something that it doesn't even sound anything like me. The first 3 tracks I made were the 2 instrumentals that are on the album, and another one which I later put lyrics on, but 3 instrumentals were the first things to come out of it. Just because I wanted something that sounded nothing like me, just nothing like it at all. But inevitably, you start to creep through even that, and my sense of tune or whatever it is started to even creep in.
Let's go back to the Egg. Were you very disappointed, or shocked, or surprised by the negative critical reaction? What do you attest?
I'm used to all that by now.
Yeah.
Nearly everything I've ever done or been involved in has had some of that negative critical reaction. You'd think that something like She Loves You with the Beatles would be pretty positive, the reaction to that. But it wasn't. The very first week out, that was supposed to be the worst song the Beatles had ever thought of doing. So through my experience, I've always had that. Ram was supposed to be the worst thing ever. But so the criticism goes down. With Back to the Egg, it was the same kind of thing. There was a load of kind of not very good criticism. The sales weren't up to our kind of normal sales thing. So a little bit I was disappointed, because I like success. I like, if I've done a song, I don't mind it going to #1, staying there for 3 months. I'm like everyone else.
But on this album, on Back to the Egg, you really took a much harder rocking approach than you had in a long time. I mean, that's been a part of you that in a sense has been submerged a little bit in Wings and so on. And it seemed to work fine. It was very refreshing. Was that a reaction to, do you feel, the previous criticism? Did you feel the whole New Wave thing happening?
It was just where I was at the time. The New Wave thing was happening. And I was thinking things like, well, a lot of the New Wave is just that they take things at a faster tempo than we do. We being like what I might call the permanent wave. Joke number 1, and the last one. So I realised, what's wrong with us doing an up-tempo song? So you get something like Spin It On, mainly out of that, just because it was just up-tempo. And I was getting influenced. I always am getting influenced, Most of the songs I've ever written, a lot of them have always had some kind of influence, either Elvis or Carl Perkins or Chuck Berry. There's always been a big influence. Or even some of the 30s type tunes, like When I'm 64 or sort of Honey Pie. That's influenced by Fred Astaire and people like that. So all my stuff's influenced. Back to the Egg was influenced. Just as what I wanted to do at the time, the direction I felt I hadn't been in for a while. So do a bit of that, The sales by most other people's standards would be very healthy. By our standards, they weren't that good. But I can never tell about albums. You know, it's strange. Like Venus and Mars, I never really liked till I went to a party and they played it, and it was just great. It really worked, and everyone was leaping up and down in the party, dancing everywhere. And I was sitting there with some music professor from some Smith, I think it was, college in America, just happened to be there, and he started kind of telling me what he thought was interesting about it, and just hearing someone else's opinion rather than just either mine, the group's, or a critic. Just hearing somebody like that and seeing how crazy it was going down at this party changed my opinion of that album totally, you know. I used to really think Wildlife was a kind of, oh no, we really shouldn't have done that one, because that was definitely an attempt to just leap in the studio. That kind of arose out of one single factor that we'd heard that Dylan had made an album in a week. He'd just run in and he'd finished it. And I kind of thought, yeah, that's where it's at that time. So we'll run in and we'll do one in about a week or so. We went in, it was done very quickly. Didn't do that well. Not that that worries me, because, you know, when you've had a lot of success, it's not too bad having some that aren't big successes, because you kind of think, well, you know,
that's a nice luxury.
It's all right, yeah, it's nice. It kind of pads out the sort of the other sides of your image rather than just all the time success. So I didn't mind it, but I wasn't that up on it. Till one day I was going down Sunset Strip, and there was this camper pulled up, the traffic lights, and some guy, just a longer guy, kind of just pulled out Wildlife. He just had a copy of it, and he just said, I'm going up in the mountains, man, and I'm taking this. I said, yeah, this is the best album you've ever made, man. And that was one guy's opinion, you know. And so that's like what happens with me and my albums. I can never tell when they're right out.
Yeah.
The minute they're right out, I'm hopeless. I'm totally confused, because I've listened to record business people telling me what's the single. I've listened to people telling me that I should change this or do that, and I'm totally confused by the time an album's out. It takes a few months after, and I start to warm to it, start to hear somebody playing it at a party, and often, like, things that have happened with me is like I hear a sound kind of in the next room, and I think, oh, and I get jealous. I think, oh my God, who's that, you know? And I go into the room, and it's us. I think, oh, I like this group. We're all right after all, you know, because everyone's like a bit paranoid.
I think it's almost universally felt that the best Wings album is Band on the Run. Do you feel that way too? Is that the most satisfying one to you, or?
Band on the Run was one of those which was going to be fully a Wings album. When we had Denny Sywell and Henry McCulloch, and Denny Lindrum herself. And what happened was they failed to turn up. We had a big kind of thing, and it was one of those numbers, and just they kind of said, I don't want to go to Lagos and record this album, man, sorry. And it was like I was left in the lurch the last minute. It was literally an hour before we were getting the plane to go on this trip to Africa to record. We didn't know what the hell was in store, but that was my kind of, you know, that was my first hint of like there was something weird happening here. So we ended up there, just three of us in Lagos, and I've played a lot of stuff myself. I played the drums myself, the bass myself, a lot of guitar with Denny, did a lot of the vocals myself, and I took a lot of control on that album. So it was almost a solo album. Almost.
When you do solo albums, on both the first one and this one, there are a lot of polyrhythms. There's a lot, I mean, you're very busy on drums.
I'm
you're
into
very
that,
sophisticated.
You know? I like that. I'm into sort of African rhythms. When we went to Lagos, the best band ever I'd ever seen live in the world was this band. The guy's in jail, I think, now, or something. He's a bit too political for the local authorities.
I know who you mean.
Fella Ransom Kuti.
Yeah.
And we saw them one night at his own club, and I was crying. It was like, it was one of those. I mean, there was a lot of it was relief, and there was a lot of other crazy circumstances. And some weird things happened while we were doing that album. Like we got held up with a knife and stuff, and there were all sorts of weird inner things going on during it. It was like a real fight to make that album. So from the start, you know, the two of them didn't turn up.
Do you find that in your experience with Wings and the Beatles, that if there is that kind of friction, that
unfortunately,
can it actually
unfortunately,
help the
it does
process?
help. Yeah, it's an unfortunate thing, because who wants to go around having stress all the time just to help the creative?
Yeah.
But when it does happen, it does seem to actually help. I mean, it's a drag, because it does. The logic then follows that we should all walk around even more stressed to make better albums. Which, like, you know, I get to a point of thinking, who needs it? You know, hell, you know, I'd rather not make albums than do that. But I think, unfortunately, I think it does help a bit, that, and it did on that one. It gave us kind of really something to fight against. But we were kind of going uphill all the way. So the two guys didn't turn up, so I had to fill in there. But then I kind of thought, yeah, but wait a minute, I love playing drums. Haha, great. And the positive side started to creep in.
I'd heard that on some of the later Beatle albums that actually some of the drumming was either done by you or else you gave Ringo the direction for it?
Very little. I gave him the what?
You gave him a sort of direction for it?
We always gave Ringo direction on every single number.
Really?
Uh-huh. It's hardly ever a number when we just said, okay, play what you feel. Mainly it was very controlled. Whoever had written the song, if it was John, he'd say, I want this. And obviously a lot of stuff came out of what Ringo was playing anyway, but we would always control it. There would hardly ever be like a break where we all didn't look at that break and think, right, we don't want anything here. I mean, some of the kind of reasons for the breakup, were things like minor reasons for it. Some of the contributory things were like, because for instance on Hey Jude, I told George not to play guitar. Because he wanted to play Hey Jude, do, 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 don't make it bad, do, 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 take a sad song, da, da, da. He wanted to echo in phrases, and I really didn't see it like that, and it was a bit of a number for me to have to dare to tell George Harrison, one of the, whichever way you look at it, one of the greats I think, to not play. It was like an insult almost. So, but we were that was how we did a lot of our stuff,
Was there that when we were talking about tension again and creative tension and how even if it's a pain in the ass it can be useful?
Yeah.
Are there any particular albums that you remember?
White Album.
The White Album.
The Tension album. The Beatles. That was the big Tension album. The rest were pretty sort of untense, not that bad, or there'd be one bit of tense and then no more tense and stuff. But the White Album was we were all in the middle of the sort of psychedelic thing or just coming out of it or whatever. But it was weird, I mean, never before have we recorded with like beds in the studio and kind of people visiting for hours on end and business meetings and all of this. And there was a lot of friction during that album. I remember once Helter Skelter came about because I read in the Melody Maker that The Who, they were talking about a track they made. Now, I don't know what the track was because I never actually heard anything that sounded like the talk.
Yeah.
But the talk was the loudest, most raucous, rock and rolling, dirtiest thing we've ever done, man. And I don't know what they were talking about. It would have been maybe an album track or something. Never caught up with what the track was. But that made me think, oh, gotta do it.
Yeah.
I really see that. And I totally got off on that one little sentence in the paper. I said, we've got to do the most loudest, most raucous, and that ended up as Helter Skelter.
That was the one that sounded the most fragmented to me, and whereas Abbey Road sounded the smoothest. I was imagining there was a lot of tension at the time Abbey Road, too.
No, there wasn't. Well, there was actually, yeah, looking back on it, but it didn't feel like a tense album. There were one or two tense moments.
Mm-hmm.
But Abbey Road for me wasn't that tense, because I was getting into a lot of musical ideas and kind of the medley thing on the second side. I was very up on doing that and very sort of excited about doing that stuff. And most of the stuff, I can't remember it being quite as tense. I think White Album was like the weirdest period because we were about to break up, and that was just tense in itself.
What about you? I want to ask you about your bass playing. In a sense, to me, you kind of play bass like a frustrated guitar player. It's sort of an inverted kind of genius. Was the bass kind of forced on you when your bass player died?
No, it was before that. It was. I originally went to Hamburg. I'd never been in a group or anything before, and we played around and we just skiffled around. I didn't have any instrument, never actually thought of buying an instrument. I was just kind of musical and just to bang away, let's say the piano at home, or I had a little guitar. Started off, the whole history is that my dad bought me a trumpet, and I tried to play trumpet and learned the Saints and a couple of things, but my lip was going funny and I realised I wouldn't be able to sing while I was playing a trumpet. I liked singing, so I traded that in for a guitar, which was a right-handed one. I couldn't work out how I couldn't play it. Then I eventually realised I had to turn it the right way.
You and Jimi Hendrix, yeah.
So I turned it like the right way, and amazingly, upon amazing, it felt good, and I was strumming with the right hand now, the correct hand, and I could get a lot more feel on it. And I got a guitar to go out to Hamburg, which is called a Rossetti Lucky 7, which is like one of the worst ever made. It was just a hunk of plywood with a pickup on it. And
strings 2 feet off the board.
Yeah, it's the worst action going, but it looked good, and that was the whole thing then. So I got to Hamburg and played for a while just as a guitar player, and just played guitar. We used to have 3 guitars. It was John, me, and George, and we used to say to people, "We don't need a drummer. The rhythm's in the guitars, man." When they used to book us, they'd say, "I haven't got a drummer." We said, "The rhythm's in the guitar." So we went there and we had a drummer then, and then we had Stu on bass. Stu decided he wanted to stay in Hamburg, and my guitar by that time had fallen apart. It eventually got smashed, you know, in a pre-Townsend Fury one night, and I used to sort of just piece it together and then plug it in with, like, not plug it in rather, just play it unplugged in. And then I got put up, it eventually just fell apart. There's no way I could even pretend to use it anymore. So I turned to the piano, because like that was the only instrument left for me. So I had a little spell of just playing piano, which time I kind of learned quite a little bit, you know, learned my way a little bit around piano. And then eventually Stuart, who was our bass player, was going to stay in Hamburg, and so there was a kind of changeover, and he like handed over to me, and he lent me his bass, and I had to play that upside down because he didn't want the strings turned over and messed around too much. So I was playing bass upside down. It's a real cockeyed way.
So you played DG, I mean, you played the strings
upside down. I just played guitar boogie like in a mirror.
Yeah.
I just played boom, 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 coming this way instead of going down. So that was a kind of crazy time, but you know, I managed that. And then eventually I got my own bass, and I was kind of in on bass. So I was always like a frustrated guitarist playing bass.
Those melodic lines, particularly the ones that showed up on Sgt. Pepper, were, I mean, there was no precedent for that in rock music.
Because I was just getting on with bass, and just always the stuff I'd always liked had been little lines that worked and yet had their own little identity instead of just staying in the background. By then anyway, bass was coming up to the fore in mixes.
Yeah.
As you listen to early Beatle mixes, and the bass and the bass drum aren't there. We were starting to take over ourselves, and bass was coming to the fore anyway, so I had to do something with it when it was getting in the fore. I was listening to a lot of kind of Motowns and Marvin Gaye and Stax and stuff, which were putting some nice little bass lines in. But I think the big influence was Pet Sounds, Beach Boys. That was the album flipped me. Still does, actually. Still one of my favourite albums of all time. Just because the musical invention on that is like, wow. But that was the big thing for me. I just thought, oh dear me, this is the album of all time. What the hell are we going to do? So my ideas took off from that standard, and I wanted to do stuff beyond that. So my bass playing started. I don't know if that was a direct result of that, but I was thinking along those lines. And so Sgt. Pepper kind of eventually came out, basically from the idea that I had about this band. It was going to be an album of another band that wasn't us. We were going to call ourselves, and just imagine all the time that it wasn't us playing this album. And it was just a nice little mind warp to get you to see the album, because when you're too close, it lent distance to the album. So I had this song written of Sgt. Pepper, and he was 20 years ago, and he taught us to play, and we're his protégés, and here we are. And then John had some good songs that he'd been writing at the time, Day in the Life, and to mention a few. And we worked on those and finished those, and George wasn't very involved in that album. He just had one song, really. It's really the only time during the whole album, main time, I remember him turning up.
That's interesting. What you're saying then is that looking at it from my side, I remember picking it up in '66 and listening to it. I thought, my God, this is the perfect fantasy album, but in the sense of creative fantasy. I mean, you put yourself into another world with it. So that's really the way you went about creating it.
Yeah, oh yeah. Because I kind of had the idea somewhere, like on a... That was the whole idea. The cover was supposed to... Originally, the cover was going to be us, dressed as this other band, in kind of crazy gear, but it was all going to be stuff that we'd always wanted to wear, all stuff that like we always secretly really liked, and it may have been there. And we were going to have photos on the wall, which were all our heroes. And it could be anything. It could be Marlon Brando in his leather jacket, or it could be Einstein. It could be anybody we'd all ever thought, oh, he was good. And it was going to be this band and all their cult heroes. And we kind of put this other identity on them to do it. And that was how it turned out. You know, the cover got changed a lot, you know, in the process. But that was the basic idea behind it, yeah, kind of fantasy show, you know.
When you're thinking back on that period, would you say that was the apex of that feeling of expansion and creativity that was going on at the time? What album would you say caught that at its height during that period?
Pepper, probably.
Yeah.
I think probably Pepper. You know, everyone's got
such a departure. I mean, that was
Rubber Soul. I don't know that. To me, all I can remember is that was a kind of straightforward album. But you know, we were beginning.
So acoustic though. Also.
Yeah,
I mean, that was very
sounds
daring.
we were into.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, if you listen to like "Hey, You Gotta Hide Your Love Away," that's John doing Dylan, basically, because Dylan had just come out, and we were big fans of Dylan. So a lot of the things would be that kind of thing, you know. Rubber Soul was just like a funny title. That's the sort of bit I remember most about it, just being a kind of catchy, silly title.
Can I?
A lot of people like that as an album. I haven't heard it, tell you the truth. It's got to be over 10 years.
It's funny. It's among like connoisseurs. It's considered like one of the high points, one of the early high points.
And the joke is, just to show you kind of how you can be wrong. You can always make mistakes. I was really, at one point, I remember being in Germany on tour, playing the album just before it came out. I got real down because I thought it was all out of tune.
Really?
Really brought down everyone. I kind of had to tell me. It was when we were trying to think of the title, Revolver. Oh, Revolver was the one I was talking about. I thought it was out of tune. Rubber Soul's enough. Cut.
Right. When you talk, we're talking about this thing about your impression of your work versus somebody else's impression.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you about. There's a thing. I was talking with Robert Fripp. You know Robert Fripp is King Crimson and whatnot.
Uh-huh.
And he's writing a piece for us, and he was talking about an artist's image and how an artist's image has a life of its own.
Yeah.
Right? And in the sense that you're Paul McCartney and you're this human being, you've got talents and tastes and so on. But in a sense, almost there's a Robert Fripp or there's a Paul McCartney, which, as Johnny Lydon would say, which has a public image, which people tend to relate to sometimes instead of relating to you as a person. Is this? I mean, this is something you've had to deal with through Wings and through the Beatles. When you first encountered this, was this something? I mean, was it like prison? Was it enjoyable? Did it cause a conflict in you when you felt that? When you saw people reacting to you as? I remember hearing that you guys, when you were in the Beatles, that you used to sort of say, well, why all the screaming? I mean, can't you just listen to the music?
At first, you're just an ordinary Joe, rocking around trying to make a living. Then you get famous, you get your first hit, and people ask you for your autograph, and you love it. There's nothing you want more than to do any amount of autographs. You want them, I'll do them,
right. And
you love it. That kind of wears off after about 3 or 4 years. You just suddenly start to think, wait a minute, what am I bloody signing for you for? So. And I've come through another phase now of just thinking, oh yeah, it's okay again. So I've been like in and out of that phase, and fame's the same thing. I remember thinking at one time I've come to some kind of point of no return where no matter even now if I say I don't want to be famous anymore, I'll be like Bridget Bardot, where she'll be a recluse but still very famous, or Charlie Chaplin. They want to get away from it. And I remember thinking, oh well, that's no use, because they're going to be after me even more. So those kind of things do come in. I think it's a very weird thing, fame. The interesting thing for me is that the only people who can ever write about it or ever get near to even explaining it most often don't want to, because it's the people who are famous themselves rather than the analysts or the commentators on it. Because the commentators can't quite get behind that mask until they're famous commentators, and even then it's still not the same. It's still a different thing. So there is a very weird kind of double-edged sword to fame.
Do you think that was John's reaction, why he's sort of...
No, I don't. I actually don't know or don't really like to speak for John, but seeing as you ask me, like, my theory is just that he's done enough. He thinks he's done enough in all the things he wanted to do, except being himself. And I think now he's actually just turned on to actually living his own life, sod everyone else. But it's not an aggressive thing, I don't think, from what I can see.
I got the feeling that when you started Wings, that in a sense, to me, it felt like you had more security, more confidence. I don't want to get into a comparison thing, but I mean, after being in the Beatles, where can one go after that?
It's difficult to top.
It's difficult to top, and I wouldn't be surprised if the other three and so on must have felt some trepidation about going out like that, and they were more tentative. You didn't seem to.
I didn't seem to, but that's one of the features of me. Is I may seem to not do a lot of things, but in actual fact, I can be just as bad as the next man. The first gigs we did with Wings were like frightening, and it was just a question of like, either I'm going to have a sing, in which case I've got to go through that frightening bit. I used to be frightened also in the Beatles. I remember many times just sitting outside concert halls being collected by the local police to be taken to, and just thinking, I really don't want to go through with this. We've got enough money, let's take the money and run, and let's go down to Brighton. But I mean, Linda and I felt that when she was having our last baby. Because there she was, as pregnant as anything, due to have the baby. And there's this terrible desire, like, let's go to Brighton instead. And almost driving us to hospital, if we could have got away with it, we would have gone to Brighton. And the Wings things were like that, you know. It was like so scary coming out with a kind of totally new band and knowing it was the Beatles was what was being expected. But it was just a question of knowing I had to go run that gauntlet and go through that thing, and just once I had a suspicion that once I came out the other side of it, I'd feel better about it.
When was it that you went around doing those tours of universities with Wings, where you just popped in?
That was one of the very first things we did. I'm not sure it was the very first. It was one of the first.
I mean, that's in a sense the philosophy of the '80s now. That type of impromptu thing. What brought you to do that?
Well, the thing was like I had a new band after the Beatles, and so the only way to not make it like a great problem was that instead of just doing what was expected, I just thought, well, what would I really like to do? What have I missed being in the Beatles, and what haven't I caught up on, and what is it time to do now for me? And one of the things, like, there were silly little things, like with the Beatles, you used to get paid massively, but you never saw it. You never saw any money, because it always went in a company, and sometimes you were allowed to draw on the company. So to me, one of the buzzes of that first tour was actually getting a bag of coins, which we then would, I mean, wasn't kind of just a materialistic thing. It was like, really, here we are being actually physically paid. And it was like going back to square one. It was really like going back. I think the only way I figured I could do it was by taking it back to where the Beatles started, just in the halls. And we charged 50p to get in, you know, which, like, we obviously could have charged a lot more. And we'd give the Students' Union a bit for having us. And it was just all very down home. And we'd play poker with the money afterwards, and I'd actually pay the band physically, you know, 50p for you, 50p for, and it brought back the kind of thrill of like actually working for a living.
Can you empathize with the new wave thing? Did you, in terms of the early Beatles and when you were in Hamburg, did you feel that same explosive force? Did you have that same kind of
I think it's always the same.
Attitude?
I think it's always the same, and hopefully it will always be the same. To me, it's just age. It's just a question of age. That when we were 18, we were doing it and getting exactly the same reaction only 20 years before that the new wave is getting now. Which is just people saying, wow, that's freaky, man. You know, even Sgt. Pepper, you know, even when we were well into it. We were doing exactly what they were doing. We were being a rock and roll group. It got christened Merseybeat, which we always hated, you know. And I'm sure a lot of them hate the new wave tag because they think of themselves just as bands and just this and that. It's just tags, you know, it'll always go on. In 20 years' time, there'll be 18-year-old boys and girls wanting to start something new. A lot of the clothes like the kids are into now, if you kind of look back, you see a lot of old rockers into all that stuff, you know. You see a lot of people doing things. I mean, Keith Richards, like, got to be one of the original punks. You know, his general look fits in very well, you know. But I don't care about all that, you know. So when we started off with the Beatles, John and I sat down to write some songs. We wrote about the first 50 or so, out of which I think Love Me Do was the only one ever got published. The rest just vanished in the mist of time. Except I've got a notebook somewhere under masses of everything that's got them written down. The thing at the time we were trying to do, which made those songs not very good, was one of the things we were trying to find the next beat. Because everyone was talking about it, all the musicals, it was in New Musical Express then, a lot more gentle paper than it is now. It's like a long time ago. And they were talking about rock calypso, you know, Latin rock is going to be the next. And we used to sit around there thinking, now what's going to be the next beat? And we'd write. And the minute we stopped trying to find that next beat, the newspaper said, it's Merseybeat. And we found that we'd discovered the next beat without even trying to discover it. And so that was what made me suspicious of categories and trying to find this and this and that, and putting everyone into, they're the heavy metal because they wear leather and they go louder. They're the more sort of ballady because they do that. Like, I've never felt in any particular sort of group, you know. My musical tastes range from like Fred Astaire to the Sex Pistols, you know, and through everything else.
The first major experience of my life and my generation where we were open to something more, some more energy and more possibilities are open to us. For me was February 1964 when I saw you on the Ed Sullivan Show. It was like something just swept over the whole country.
It was funny, wasn't it, huh?
Now, what the hell was it all about?
Was it that? I don't know. I personally think that, like in America, there was very much a way to do things. And the only slightly freaky things would be like the Hollywood writers or the jazz musicians or the pop musicians, the Elvises and so on and so, they were being different. But in America, they were all still in a framework. Mm-hmm. And I think the British thing that we cooked up, we had a long time to cook it up quietly, make all our mistakes in private, mm-hmm. Hamburg. Well, no one was watching. By the time one of the big things about the Beatles, which I always think new groups should take as a bit of advice, was that we were cheeky enough to say we won't go to the States ever till we've got a #1 record. It's a pretty cheeky kind of thing.
In the States, #1 record.
Yeah, in the States. So we were offered tours, but we knew we'd be second to someone. We didn't want that. And there were a lot of artists still from here who go over. Sex Pistols, and they vanish. Cliff Richard, still trying to make it in the States. And we always looked at it logically and thought, well, that's the mistake. They've got to go in as #1. Then they're going to do. So there was a lot of careful thought here. We were cooking up this act, the Beatles. It was very European, very sort of British, as opposed to like the standard American way of doing things. Ed, a couple of jugglers, Sinatra Jr., even Elvis from the waist up. There was a very definite way that the Americans did it, the American dream. I just think that like Americans had it going one certain way, and the Beatles was just such a different thing that we'd been cooking up. We'd been taking all the influences from America, distilling them in a British way. A lot of things have been happening just with our own chemistry, because you had John and I were strong writers, George who was like a third writer, Ringo who had like a good head on his shoulders and was by no means thick, and we were just developing our chemistry. We put in a lot of work. Hamburg used to work 8 hours a day, which most bands never worked that hard. We literally worked 8 hours a day, and it was a full factory day. So we had developed our act. By the time we came to America, we had a #1 record, which we'd worked that out. Mm-hmm. We were playing in Paris at the time, and Telegram came, and we all jumped on each other's backs and ran around everywhere. And Big Mal, the roadie, used to give everyone piggybacks everywhere. We were just so excited. So we went to America. There it all was what we'd planned might happen. Mm-hmm. But we were lucky, and it went much further than we'd ever imagined. But actually we'd thought the whole thing out. And so there was like a combination of all this thing, America being what it was, and us coming with this whole new thing that we'd thought out, based on the old thing, but with our own sort of variations on it. All the little success we'd been having in Britain. The newspapers in Britain had been saying, well, what's left to do? You've conquered everywhere. And we'd say, America. So, oh yeah, of course, yeah. We'd say, America, watch out. Got the #1, went to America, did Ed Sullivan. By then we'd like distilled our stuff down to an essence. So we weren't just coming on as just any old band. We had our identity, this total new identity for us.
Could you feel that among you? Was there a particular spirit?
Yeah, we knew it. Yeah. Well, people were saying, what's this with the haircuts? Now, if I go back on the haircut thing, I know it was actually because we saw some guy in Hamburg whose hair we liked. John and I were hitchhiking to Paris. We asked him to cut our hair like he did his. He didn't do it quite the same as his, and it fell down in a Beatles cut. His was actually more like this, coming over to one side.
Hitler, yes.
Not Hitler, but a kind of long-haired Hitler thing.
Yeah, no, I know.
All coming down. We wanted that.
He was Lawrence, actually. That's the way his hair was.
He was a very sort of artsy guy, this guy. He was a great guy called Jürgen. He was a photographer, friend of everyone's from Hamburg. And he was living in Paris. He cut our hair. We just came back to England. All the people in England thought we were German, because the newspapers said direct from Hamburg,
right.
The Beatles. So all the kids thought we were German. They were all surprised. We had leather jackets and blue jeans. We went out of that phase and went more suits, because we were going to come down to London, and we developed the sort of suits thing, and we thought we won't have corny suits, we'll have nude kind of things. So we got those cardan jackets. We were working on the whole thing, and so by the time we sort of got to the States there, to say, for instance, the hair, what was really a bit of an accident, and it was really sort of what a lot of artsy people were doing anyway. We were the first with it in the States, so it looked like we'd invented it. Actually, the story was not half as exciting. It was much more ordinary, like life is. But by the time it actually got to the presentation on the Ed Sullivan show, the biggest show in the States, and there we were with these funny haircuts, it was us. Everyone used to say, you started the Beatle haircut. And so it was like just distilling the whole essences of all these changes we were going through, and we just laid it all in one big move on the Americans. That's why it had such a big shocking effect, I think.
When was it apparent to you that something was going on here that was more than just another very big group, that this was a cultural phenomenon? I mean, could you realize that at the time? Or
you don't get into that. I mean, anyone who's kind of successful, I don't think you get into that. I don't think Ali, when he was shouting he was the greatest, knew he was. I think it was bluff, it was showbiz. He suspected he was, we suspected we were. But a lot of what you did was just bluff. It's showbiz, you know, this is showbiz. You want to be number one, you better tell everyone you're number one.
But when did you realize, my God, it's worked? I mean, this is even more than just a musical event. This is a whole generation.
Very early on, we wherever we went, we started off in Hamburg, basically. And we started off having no audience, and we had to work our arses off to try and get people in. People would appear at the door of the club, and we were on stage and there was nobody at the tables. We used to try and get them in to sell beer for the manager. And we used to, the minute you saw someone, we'd all go, dance in the streets, or whatever was one of our big numbers. Dance in the streets is one of them. Dance in the streets tonight, and we'd pretend we hadn't seen them, and we'd rock out, and you'd find we got 3 of them in. And so we were very much trained on this idea of like what do they call them, barkers, the fairground almost. You'd see 4 people, and we had to get those 4 people in. And so this knack is like very important, obviously, in showbiz, how to attract those 4 people in to sell 4 bottles of beer for the man who's paying us. We eventually sold the club out, and that, I would say, then we started to know it was going to be big, because we really started to get a Saturday night audience, which then started to be an all-week audience. Then we went to another club, the same thing happened there. Then we went back to England, and we started playing the Cavern. Same thing happened there. People didn't bother coming, then they started coming, they came in the droves. So we could see that each place we went at, whereas when we got started there was nothing. When we finished playing at that club, there was always like this incredible excitement that built up. And there must have been, we knew there was something we were doing that must have been right. So by the time we came down to play tours and stuff, it didn't really surprise us, although they were all thrills, but it didn't really surprise us that when we were on the Chris Montez tour, he was top of the bill. It didn't surprise us halfway through the tour when they switched it. They put us top of the bill and him second. It was embarrassing. The hell for him, you know, what could you say to him? Sorry, Chris.
Right.
You know, and he took it well and stuff, but it was embarrassing. But we expected it by then. We'd seen that everywhere we'd gone it seemed to work. And another thing we thought was that, like, all the old-time vaudeville performers were all saying, the trouble with today's entertainers is they've got no background. But we did. We always thought we had this ace up our sleeve of having this hard background in Hamburg. Or I did, anyway. I think the others felt similarly, you know. That here we were, we'd actually had done this grounding these old vaudevillians were talking about, of having grafted 8 hours.
Is that what, do you think that's what made the group able to weather the incredible pressures of that and last as long as
it didn't feel like pressures. It wasn't pressures, you know, for a whole long time. It's only when you actually, you know, I mean, people used to always ask the question in American conferences, press conferences, what would you do when the bubble bursts? There used to be a guy like yourself who we used to take around because he was so funny. We used to ask him to ask that question every time. And he did it. He came around to every press conference. That was the only question he ever asked on the whole tour. And he just got to be like a court jester kind of thing.
And what'd you say?
Yeah, you know, man, I don't know. We'll blow up, or I don't know, we'll fall down out of the sky, or so and so, whatever. But it was never a serious question to us. Of course, when the bubble did burst, or
when did it start to fragment?
To burst? I don't know, man. Just about a year before the Beatles broke up, I suppose. You could say the seed was sown from very early on. I don't know, really. It just did. Friction came in, business things came in, relationships between each other. We were all looking for, like, people in our lives, like, and John had found Yoko. It made it very difficult. He wanted a very strong, intimate life with her. At the same time, we'd always reserved the intimacy for the group. So you were starting to find those kind of things were clashing, really, you know, with Yoko. You could understand he had to have time with her. But does he have to have that much time with her, you know, was the sort of feeling in the group. And so these things just started to create immovable objects and pressures that were just too big. And then after that, after the breakup, then the idea of when will the bubble burst came home. You just suddenly think, oh, that's what that guy was talking about. Every bloody press conference. That's what he meant. And then I did think for a few years, heck, like the bubble has burst and so on and so on. And so on. And so there was a fraught period there, like kind really all those sort of things that people would always be saying, the pressures. I thought, oh, that's what they mean. These are the pressures, I finally understood what pressures were. Too much autographs and all of that didn't need to be too much of a pressure because we were a very organised group, the Beatles. And it was always Mal, or one of our men, could always cool out the situation. We had it very organised. Mm-hmm. We were very much a well-rehearsed unit amongst ourselves. We knew the gig. We knew the whole thing, press conferences, anything. It was just something we'd done a lot of. So it never used to feel that much of a pressure. Eventually, you started to realise what they were talking about, as I think a lot of people do just when they grow up. When you grow out of your teens and your 20s, you start to realise, wait a minute, I am really holding down a job here. And if my pay goes down, I'm out of a job, and I've got 2 kids now. Those are the things that do start to occur to you later in life.
You can kind of freely go back into that period now and talk to me about it and pull out things, which I think is also very unusual. Did it take a while for that to happen?
I've just done this clip, which is me playing all the instruments like I do on the album.
I saw that, yeah.
Which is, and I do Beatle Paul in that.
I noticed, yeah.
And it was my idea to do it because we had to think of someone we'd make the bass player like. And I kind of said, well, I could do Beatle Paul. And the director said, yeah, you've got to. And I said, oh, well, and I almost chickened out at the end of it. But once I did it and put on the old uniform, got my violin bass, which has actually still got a list from the Beatles, stellar-taped to it. It's like an antique. The minute I'd done that, I didn't realise till a couple of days after that I'd actually had gone and broken the whole voodoo of talking about the Beatles. Because I'd been him again. And I just actually stood there and it didn't feel bad. I thought, it's a laugh, what the hell, I mean, if someone else is going to impersonate me, I might as well do it myself. And it was such a buzz amongst all the studio technicians. They all really got off on it. It was like, can I have your autograph?
Yeah.
And it was weird, it was really like I'd gone back 20 years or 10 years or whatever. It was a very kind of weird, exciting feeling, really, to just do it. And now
Did you feel like you were stepping back into that image for a minute? And
it was great. I just felt great. I really was. I felt like I was at a TV show 20 years ago. Because it felt exactly the same. The bass was the same weight. See, the thing about the Hofner bass is it's like balsa wood. It's so comfortable. After a kind of Fender or a Rickenbacker, I now play like a Yamaha or a Rickenbacker, which is so bloody heavy.
Why did you switch that Rickenbacker on that?
It was given to me.
Oh, really?
Mr. Rickenbacker came down, the kind of head representative, when we were in LA. And he said, "But I'd like to give you a specially made left-handed bass." And it was the first left-handed bass I'd ever had, because the Hofner was a right-handed converted. It was a freebie, and I loved it. And I played it, and I started to get into it on Sgt. Pepper and everything. Hi, baby. And so that was like I really started to get into the Rickenbacker then. And then again, I must be a skinflint actually, because then now I'm playing a Yamaha just because they gave me one. So I'm anybody's for a free guitar. It was a bit funny, because I do sometimes think, wait a minute, I'm supposed to actually research what instrument I want to play best, but it happens so random. I've ended up playing stuff that's been given me, that I like, obviously. I've been given stuff I don't really like so much. But I like it like that. I like stuff happening like that. I don't like things to be too logical. I'd prefer to be non-technical. It's how I recorded this new album. It's why, the guy could have set me up with a beautiful console.
It's funny because it sounds very technical. It sounds very precise.
All the engineering is just me literally doing what I was doing there. Mm-hmm. And I tell you, if I get a vocal I don't like, I'd go whoop, rewind, and erase, and that would be the vocal gone forever. I was just kind of totally ruthless and just played. I made the record as if it was on a giant cassette recorder. So as it was on a 16 track. But I'm suspicious of formulas. When a minute I've got a formula, I try and change it because I don't want a formula.
Boring.
Because people used to ask us, what comes first, the words or the music, or Lennon and McCartney, who does what? It was never. It was always, well, we all do a bit of everything. I sometimes write words, he sometimes writes words, I sometimes write a tune, he sometimes writes a tune. Words sometimes come first, tunes sometimes come first. And everything always had this kind of... So I've just continued doing it that way, and now I just kind of say, just listen. If it sounds good to me, if I think I've got a sound that I wanted, or it sounds better than what I wanted, and then I'll have it. I kind of accept it, and it's filed then, that's okay then. If I don't like it, I just erase it. And it was great fun, you know, because like I'd make some goofs on bass.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of doing the whole track again,
Mm-hmm.
I just stopped there, and from like 22 on the meter to 26, I knew I didn't like it, so I just go, gone. You know, and I could see some perfectionists or people saying, oh, don't lose it, leave it for posterity or whatever. But I was just being totally ruthless and enjoying it.
There was a Freudian slip before when you were talking about the Beatle thing and so on, about
Probably.
how you prepared for it, you know, and the setting up the group in Hamburg.
Yeah.
You said you kind of got the knack of knowing how to do this, which obviously the question is, what do you think of them? I mean,
I've actually only heard one record of theirs, the single, My Sharona. And this is alright. I haven't heard anything else, so I can't really comment on them. You know, I suspect they're kind of an okay pop group. Obviously, the Beatles, of anything, have had the most imitators and the copiers, even when the 60s thing was going on. Every friend of ours was a copier. I mean, you'll notice how everyone's hairstyles changed, including like Cliff Richards and Elvis. The hair all suddenly came forward, you know. So like I'm kind of used to seeing everyone do numbers. ELO, and a lot of their stuff was very Sgt. Pepper inspired or whatever, you know.
But I Am the Walrus Forever.
I'm the Walrus again, you know. Again, I'm the Walrus. I'm still the Walrus.
Are you the Walrus? Who's John right?
The Walrus was a nothing thing, not meant anything about anyone. It was very read into, and what happened was when we did Magical Mystery Tour and portrayed it, I actually put on the Walrus mask, the one on that wall all swaying. Happens to be me with the Walrus thing. We just picked up a head each. There was no thought behind it. All of our stuff, as you can tell from talking to me now, has never had really deep thought. I had a black carnation because they'd run out of red ones. And I said, all right, I'll have a black one. I'll have whatever you've got. So I got this hugely significant thing of a black carnation. I had my back turned on the Sgt. Pepper cover. It was actually just a goof when we were doing the photos. I turned my back and it was like a joke or whatever it was.
I think it's amazing that you actually played bass better after you died, which was really impressive. But the other
it's never been done before, yeah. Now, but I say, you know, imitators and stuff, it's a form of flattery, and I, in a way, feel slightly sorry for them rather than myself, because I figure, what are those Beatlemania guys going to do in the long run? Okay, they can have a bit of success here, but I'd rather see them do well.
If they were to imitate you, what they should be doing, in a sense, from everything
their own shit together,
is be creative in the
absolutely, you know, based on the inspiration that we gave them. Fine, you know, because it'll last longer, and I'd like to see them last longer. You know, having made it and knowing how bloody hard it is to keep making it and to continue in success, I'm really for anyone who can make it. I don't care if they're the world's worst Mrs. Miller or somebody, you know, I don't care. As long as they make it and it's what they want to do, I've got sympathy for them. You know.
So that's part of your affinity or your good feelings about New Wave, is you see that same creative element.
Yeah, I mean, I think the New Wave, the nice thing about it is kind of, it's got back to kind of real music rather than pop. I mean, I'd much rather see that than a lot of the stuff that was beginning to happen just to fill a need. Mm-hmm. It had to happen. I mean, I think that's all cool. You know, I don't like a lot of it. A lot of it, I can see where it's all come from. Mm-hmm. A lot of the riffs are right out of the Doors songbook. Mm-hmm. You know, a lot of it is well kind of Lou Reed and Bowie and Brian Ferry, and you can just trace it back, a lot of it. But that's great. I was influenced by Elvis. I still do an Elvis impersonation, you know, if you catch me at a party or something with McGee. I still do. There's a leak, you know, from Love Me Tender. Mm-hmm. I love it, you know. I mean, I recognise that we're all these very frail people, no matter who puts on the great show in the front. That basically we're all just these very frail people who all imitate, all copy. We used to nick songs, man. We used to nick titles, we used to nick everything. John and I,
know that when
greatest cribbers going.
We didn't even know that the Chuck Berry songs and that type of thing were we thought
nicks.
Those were your original songs?
We had cover versions, which we didn't realise were cover versions. I used to know the Crew Cuts singing Earth Angel. Mm-hmm. And it's the actual real version, supposed to be the Penguins. I got the autograph of the Crew Cuts at the Liverpool Empire. I waited around in my short trousers and they were nice. So, you know, I kind of, you know, I've been where all these people are coming from. And so I kind of sympathise with it, you know, and rather than just stand there and get jealous because someone's younger than I am.
The criticism you've come in for, it seems to me, has to do with the fact that you use pop as a medium. What is it about pop that you are attracted to. It seems to be something that you like.
I just like it, man. I'm like a lot of people. When you get in your car, you turn on the radio and you want to hear some good sounds, you know. And if you've got a really good radio station that gives you, which there's not a lot of, but if you get a really good station, that's the kind of stuff I love. You know, I love to hear a great new track from Stevie Wonder. So that's the kind of stuff I'm into. So whenever I write for that. You know, I don't. Sometimes I'll write like to try and write a hit. Sometimes I'll write to try and not write a hit. But just popular music seems to me like where it's at. Because what are the alternatives? To write a serious piece of music, boring. Mm-hmm. To write modern classical music, no thanks. You know, I bore myself stiff after a couple of bars, I think.
Well, when you do write the stuff and so on, the themes that you generally go over and over again have to do with the home, domesticity, kind of a feeling of unity and a family feel and so on. I was wondering, did that come out of the whole craziness of the '60s? In a sense, was this were you trying to create
it came out of getting married, really.
So on?
Came out of getting married, which is you could call a creative womb. It's just when you get married and you haven't been married for 30 years. I was what? 29, I think, when I got married. Things change. Everything changes in the way you look at things. You look at through a partner's eyes, and you learn new things. And I started to kind of realise that I liked the warmth of a family. And so when I got married, you know, then a lot of my stuff did start, like the word home, changed its meaning. Instead of just being home, we're home, homeward bound. It started to really mean, hey, home, you know, like I've never had a home for a long time.
Right.
Because I was very much bachelor for a long time. Started to realise, you know, that's important, this is important, so on and so on, warmth, and like being kind of blatant about your feelings and investigating them rather than hiding them. On this new album, I've got a track called Waterfalls, which is basically saying, don't go doing a load of dangerous stuff, because I need you. And that's a kind of more mature thought for me than I would have been able to have done 20 years ago. Because I just didn't realise like that it's not all going to be here forever. That's the kind of thing that you start to realise once you pass 30.
A lot of the images have to do with childhood. Do you feel did you have a happy childhood yourself?
Yeah.
Does that just sort of come up from your subconscious? Because, I mean, a lot of people have written and said that something as simple as a nursery rhyme has a lot of power to it.
Like Mary Had a Little Lamb, something like that. That was totally, I don't put, the word round about the time was that I'd released Give Ireland Back to the Irish. It had been banned, or Hi Hi Hi, one of them. Which, Ireland was political song, so it was banned. Hi 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 was supposed to be drugs and sex, that was banned. And then the next single was Mary Had a Little Lamb, and people thought it was like my way of saying, okay, try and ban this.
Right.
But it actually wasn't. It was actually because my kids were very young, and anything I sang to them didn't make sense other than stuff like that. Once I started doing Bar Bar Black Sheep, they went crazy. But they were my audience. So I just did it as a single, you know. Again, because I just thought, well, there are children in the world, you know, we're not all grown up yet. And so for kids, that's hopefully a kid's record. We're not all, hopefully I'm not grown up. That's the worst is going to be to actually be grown up. But I'm doing quite well, actually, on that score. I haven't grown up an awful lot. But, you know, you can say all of that stuff about it. I tend to just sort of dismiss it a bit and just say I've done some songs that I would think are really good. I've done some songs I don't think quite came off. Some I hate. But in the kind of whole story of it all, I've done enough to satisfy myself that I'm okay. That's basically all I'm looking for, you know, like most other people.